Okay, so on week one, we learned that medieval political philosophers were, in fact, aware of this simple and basic division of regimes into ones that emphasize virtue, ones that emphasize wealth, ones that emphasize status, ones that emphasize popular participation in governance, and ones that are simply tyrannical and go by the whims of a tyrant or a despot, which could be also a group, a small group. We also became aware that, at least in the case of Ibn Rushd, he has a certain interpretation of Islamic government history and social history that assumes that a mix of what he calls Medina Jama'iyya, closest term to democracy, but by that he means popular family rule, a mix of that popular family rule on one hand and some kind of emphasis on status, which comes closest to democracy. That is one step away from aristocracy when those in charge are not particularly people who emphasize justice in their character and care about justice in society, but people who inherited that emphasis and became eventually just people who emphasize their own status. He says that this is how things went. So over a period of about 500 to 600 years from the founding of Islam until his time in Cordoba in the 12th century of the Common Era or the 6th Islamic century, this is how things went. That's not what Mawardi tells us, which is what we learned in the second week. We learned that there was some degree of keeping up with the initial tradition, which was that elections of those in charge were done by people who took responsibility for the community in normal times. That the community was in fact virtuous in a sense in which it was trying to keep up with its own tradition. The reconciliation of reason in the abstract, the general pursuit of wisdom and correct behavior and so on. The reconciliation of that on the one hand and what happened historically wouldn't be that hard for a political philosopher or a political scientist, if you use that word in the general sense, where it includes both political philosophy and an understanding of the practice itself. So in our third week of this course, we're going back to Ibn Rushd because he has a statement of method that I find to be very basic and important. What exactly is the relationship between reason and tradition? What exactly is the relationship between Sharia in the general sense in which it includes faith and basic beliefs and what makes a human being what he or she is on the most basic sense? If you travel with this thought, for example, to European philosophy, you would find the idea of the impressions and the emotions. Someone like Hume, for example, in his sense of how human understanding happens or the layers of it. One layer is the emotions, the ideas that are too vague to express. Take all this in when you think of Sharia. It's what we believe, it's who we are, it's what we think as a community or even as an individual, the impulses, the basic impulses. All this on the one hand in hikmah, which is reason, diverse traditions, things that we could learn from other people who don't share our religion, all these things. How do we link these two? And the question comes in the form of a request for fatwa. The fatwa that's solicited is a request about whether the study of philosophy itself, نظر في الفلسفة وعلوم المنطق, it can qualify as simply something that's open to anybody to do, neutral, meaning we can do it, we may not do it, permissible, whatever we think like maybe good for some people, not good for others, but at least available, or prohibited. And why would any study be prohibited? Well, sometimes certain fields are just, they lead to confusion. We get nothing other than just being unsure. We waste the time, we learn nothing. And in fact, it's something we say until today in Islam's 15th century and in the 21st century of the Common Era. We tell people, well, don't study that thing. It's just a waste of time. It's not going to help you in any way. So is it mubah? Is it mahdhur? Or is it a good thing, in which case it could fall under the supererogatory, something that we recommend but we don't necessarily require, or that it in fact is somehow required. It is important for everybody to get some kind of dose of that. Well, that's a question, again, as I said, is given to Ibn Rushd as a former judge or as an actual judge. Well, his opinion, of course, as a judge, you work for the government and you don't exactly have full freedom to just go by your opinion. And Ibn Rushd knows that from practice, because occasionally he did things that the government didn't want him to do, and he paid the cost. So it is a judge who acts like a mufti. And the basic distinction between muftis and judges broadly is that muftis can opine about anything. They can answer questions about rituals, for example, while judges don't get to do that. They have to have a specific conflict or adversity, and they have to look up rights. The mufti, with this broad jurisdiction, lacks, of course, the power to enforce any of his opinions. Essentially, his opinions are just recommendations, and he stands on the authority of his own capacity to persuade or sound authoritative. On the other hand, the judge has the enforcement and can, in fact, depending on how powerful the state is, he can whip your ass, if that makes sense. So these are two basic distinctions between the two. We have to take Ibn Rushd here to be acting as a mufti. So what does he say? إن كان فعل الفلسفة ليس شيئا أكثر من النظر في الموجودات واعتبارها من جهة دلالتها على الصانع، أعني من جهة ما هي مصنوعات، فإن الموجودات إنما تدل على الصانع بمعرفة صنعته، وإنه كلما كانت المعرفة بصنعتها أتم كانت المعرفة بالصانع أتم. وكان الشرع قد ندب إلى اعتبار الموجودات وحث على ذلك، فبين أن ما يدل عليه هذا الاسم إما واجب في الشرع وإما مندوب إليه. A quick syllogism here. He says, if we take as premise number one that what philosophy does is it allows you to observe the world and study it, possibly looking for a source for it, trying to understand where it comes from, because that's what happens when you study something and you begin to understand its causes or guess its causes. That's what happens in your mind. You begin to understand it more deeply. Given that, that's premise one. Premise two, that in fact, this Sharia, this law of ours, wants you to know. It's asking you to reflect. He will later show exactly how it does that, because the Quran explicitly says, فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. Go look, go search, go think. So it's not exactly something that he concocted, it's explicit. So assuming that P1, which is that philosophy does that, that is, it adds to your understanding, and P2, which is that the religion asks you to do that, then we get to the conclusion here, and the conclusion is that, well, this has to be either recommended or obligatory, because it's asking you to do it, and this thing does it. So either that now you're required to do it, if it's so essential, required to do it, right, wajib, or that it is at least something that you should do when you can. Okay. فأما أن شرع دعا إلى اعتبار الموجودات بالعقل. So to prove to you, premise two, I'm going to tell you about all these verses. فاعتبروا يا أولي الأبصار أولم ينظروا في ملكوت السماوات والأرض وما خلق الله من شيء he also says أعلم الله تعالى أن ممن خصه بهذا العلم وشرفه به إبراهيم عليه السلام فقال وكذلك نري إبراهيم ملكوت السماوات والأرض. He's still citing evidence that God cares that you reflect, but in this case it's a little less direct because he's saying I have given this capacity to someone in the past that Ibrahim can. And there are other verses that are a little more narrow. Look at the camels, how they're created. Look at the skies. Who did that exactly? That sort of thing. وإذا تقرر أن الشرع قد أوجب النظر بالعقل في الموجودات واعتبارها وكان الاعتبار ليس شيئا أكثر من استنباط المجهول من المعلوم واستخراجه منه وهذا هو القياس أو بالقياس فوجب أن نجعل نظرنا في الموجودات بالقياس العقلي. Some sleight of hand here because the word qiyas clearly is a homonym. It could mean the legal analogy that a jurist is familiar with. It could also mean that syllogism that we just talked about. But what he's hoping for is something a little more technical, which is the best kind of qiyas is the burhan. That will exclude most of Muslim theology because in his mind, the mutakallimin or the theologians were not really that serious about their arguments. They were rhetorical. They were interested in popular knowledge. They used premises from popular knowledge and therefore ended up with results that could only work for the masses or people who were not as rigorous in their thinking. But he's kind of running alone here. وبين أن هذا النحو من النظر الذي دعا إليه الشرع وحث عليه هو أتم أنواع النظر بأتم أنواع القياس والمسمى برهان وإذا كان الشرع قد حث على معرفة الله تعالى وسائر الموجودات بالبرهان وكان من الأفضل أو الأمر الضروري لمن أراد أن يعلم الله تبارك وتعالى وسائر الموجودات بالبرهان أن يتقدم أولا فيعلم أنواع البراهين والشروط. Really running alone here because he's saying, well, you really need to know God. Well, here is how, and philosophers do that best. And in fact, the most important distinction for him is that distinction between qiyas al-burhani, which is what philosophers do. So qiyas al-burhani doesn't allow any premise that could be questionable. If we talk about physics, for example, we can't say, look, there are magnets, for example, in the world. Therefore, there are creepy things, and we could have angels, or we could have jinn. No, that's not burhani. Qiyas al-jadali allows that. So qiyas al-jadali is that realm where your theologians are going to be comfortable kind of introducing things that people will simply accept, but I am here. I am interested in al-qiyas al-burhani. So qiyas al-jadali, qiyas al-khatabi, qiyas al-mughalati, all these. Al-khatabi, of course, that's the one that takes from khatabiyat or popular beliefs. Al-mughalati, that is actually a contrarian's kind of qiyas. So someone who is clearly trying to undermine somebody else's argument, not necessarily make any of his own. And al-jadali is dialectical, which could also be a kind of mughalata or a kind of, mughalata is not exactly contrarian, but someone who wants to trap you, right, in argument. So instead of having a goal, they're trying to just undermine yours. Anyway, so you have to know the distinction between these because the only thing I'm going to give you or allow you to work with is that burhan. And of course, that will set him aside and alone within Muslim theology. He'll find that the Ash'aris are not doing the job, even the Mu'tazilis are not doing the job. Anyway, so since these distinctions are important, he says, وَكَانَ لَا يُمْكِنُ ذَلِكَ دُونَ أَنْ يَتَقَدَّمَ فَيَعْرِفَ قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ مَا هُوَ الْقِيَاسُ الْمُطْلَقُ وَكَمْ أَنْوَاعُهُ. All these technical issues that are required for someone basically to have to go through Aristotle's books. You have to know what the analysis of words can lead to and understand what the qiyas al-mutlaq is. So of course, the commentators here, the editors go on and tell you what Farabi said about these little things. And I'm not really interested in this. The point here is that philosophy or logic in the most academic and most advanced level for him is not something that we could say, well, this is just for other people or for specialists or people who debate, philosophers debate, theologians. For him, it's a real requirement for research. It's as if you come, for example, to study philosophy in the 20th century, and you say, well, can I do it without Kant, without studying Immanuel Kant? And somebody says, no, you can't. You're not going to go anywhere. Look at all the utilitarians, for example, in England who tried to do philosophy without Kant. They're not real philosophers, and you can mock them. And so he's doing something like that. He's saying that to be a true academic, to be someone who's interested, later, of course, he'll distinguish between this status and someone who's just trying to get a general idea about why Islam is reasonable, or Islamic beliefs are reasonable. So this is something I think Ibn Rushd suffered a lot from, which, by the way, led, if you're really interested in pursuing this discussion, when Ernst Renan wrote his book about Averroes and Averroism, which was a product of the 19th century, now dated text and all, but it's an interesting text because Renan correctly notices that Ibn Rushd had many moments where he was making recommendations to special people and then saying, that's not for everybody. And Renan actually goes a little far, and I'm not sure I agree with him, where he says that Ibn Rushd was deliberately hiding some of his beliefs, even from the people who were, well, kind of his peers, but not really his peers. So he was teaching people to hide their beliefs because at some point people are going to lose you. And they will think that you have to believe certain things to be literal and to be a good Muslim, when in fact Ibn Rushd doesn't believe any of that. But let's keep going. All these distinctions about qiyas are very important to understand the nature of premises, to be stingy in accepting premises that don't pass the correct tests. All that is required. Then the hackneyed and weird analogy with fiqh and the process of fiqh, and how, to an extent, if it is really, really good, its qiyas will be just as rigorous. He says, فإنه كما أن الفقيه يستنبط من الأمر بالتفقه في الأحكام وجوب معرفة المقاييس الفقهية على أنواعها وما منها قياس وما منها ليس بقياس، كذلك يجب على العارف أن يستنبط من الأمر بالنظر في المحدثات وجوب معرفة القياس العقلي وأنواعه، بل هو أحرى بذلك، لأنه إذا كان الفقيه يستنبط من قوله تعالى فاعتبروا يا أولي الأبصار وجوب معرفة القياس الفقهي، فكم بالحري والأولى أن يستنبط من ذلك أو أن يستنبط من ذلك العارف بالله وجوب معرفة القياس العقلي. This is something he knows as a legal theorist. This same verse appears a lot in Usul al-Fiqh books, and it is the foundation for doing al-Qiyas al-Fiqhi. What's al-Qiyas al-Fiqh? Qiyas al-Fiqh is, it's usually 4 elements, not 3. I don't have 2 premises and a conclusion. I have a case that I know, we'll call it case known, and a case that is unknown, that is the new question. And I have a shared cause for the law or foundation for the law. And from that, I get to the conclusion of equating the unknown case with the known case. Example, this is too abstract. I know for sure that a drink that is specifically or explicitly mentioned in the Quran as prohibited, that is a grape-based drink that is usually has some intensity in it, the so-called zabad, right? Fermentation leads to a certain intensity in the viscosity of the drink. That grape-based intense kind of drink is prohibited. And I don't know if I were to make a similar drink, for example, from apple or from onions or whatever. That's the case that's unknown. I wouldn't know how to judge that one. But I know they share a cause. What is the shared cause? They affect the mind usually in the average individual the same way. Therefore, I'll equate the drink that is made from apple or made from some other, whatever, now they can make it from anything, with the known case. This qiyas fiqhi is, yes, it stands on the same verse, فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. And very few people inside that industry of fiqh would dispute that this is a good procedure in applying the verse. But again, Ibn Rushd is alone when he says, well, the qiyas al-aqli, that thing that we will learn from the Greek, or even in some cases, actually, the Romans also added some little wrinkles. When you study medicine, for example, some of the stuff that Galen taught. Galen, of course, is a Greek guy, but living in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, and his understanding of medicine also relies a little bit on the Aristotelian ideas of how we can infer from known knowledge things that we don't know. Objection. وليس لقائل أن يقول إن هذا النوع من النظر في القياس العقلي بدعة. Nobody should tell me that using this qiyas aqli that comes with philosophy and natural philosophy and medicine and similar things, that is an innovation. إذ لم يكن في الصدر الأول, because companions didn't do it. The initial generation didn't have that. فإن النظر أيضا في القياس الفقهي وأنواعه وشيء مستنبط بعد الصدر الأول. If your armamentarium of arguments will include that cheap shot of telling me that this qiyas aqli would never be known either to the Prophet or his companions, well, the same is true about your qiyas fiqhi too. It was known. Why are you so comfortable in saying that this is not an innovation? فكذلك يجب أن يعتقد في النظر في القياس العقلي، ولهذا سبب ليس هذا موضوع ذكر، بل أكثر أصحاب هذه الملة مثبتون القياس العقلي إلا طائفة من الحشوية قليلة وهم محجوجون بالنصوص. So he gets to be kind of really argumentative here. He's saying, well, I know that this issue has been discussed and philosophers have looked at it, but just to give you a quick summary of what happened, the truth is, we have disagreement, but these people who disagreed are just literalist hashwiya or literalist. Hashwiya here is defined as the anthropomorphists. And hashwiya are more than anthropomorphists. They tend to be literalists in other areas too. But he says these people are definitely the ones who are walking alone. We are in the majority among philosophers and among people of this craft when we say that qiyas aqli is necessary. That this idea of inferring conclusions from premises, if we're good and tight about our premises and good and tight about the relationship between the conclusion and the premises, we know exactly the requirements of the qiyas, that syllogism, then we are within the right. And in fact, that's what people do all the time. Now, of course, it's one problem, I think, in Rushd's writing all the time, is that he knows that the people who get it right are the minority. And very few people can follow what he's doing. But he is right to say that a mitigated version of this very rigorous thinking goes on all the time. In the study of history, for instance, in the study of literature, even in literary theory, in many areas in, how do we call them, the intellectual and humanities sciences. We call them the Islamic humanities. The Islamic humanities tend to actually use many of these ideas that are shared between Arabs and Greek and other Mediterranean people, but not to the same extent of strictness. Anyway, next piece. فإذا تقرر أنه يجب بالشرع النظر في القياس العقلي كما يجب النظر في القياس الفقهي، فبين أنه إن كان لم يتقدم أحد ممن قبلنا بفحص عن القياس العقلي وأنواعه أنه يجب علينا أن نبتدأ بالفحص. If we were to see that nobody before us built a science for that general reasoning, some kind of research method, then we have to invent it. We should invent that science if it wasn't there, or that type of literature, that type of method statement. وأن يستعين في ذلك المتأخر والمتقدم. If among us some people invented that method, then we can draw on their work. فإنه عسير أو غير ممكن أن يقف واحد من الناس من تلقائه وابتدائه على جميع ما يحتاج إليه من ذلك. This idea that, of course, in modern times becomes an argument for specialization. It's impossible for an individual to test every assumption that they come up with. They have to trust that certain things were studied already and we got some foregone conclusions. But we will invent the science if it didn't exist. Of course, he knows it was invented, so he wanted to say, well, let's just build on what we have. And to introduce that thought, it's hard to build everything out of scratch. كما أنه عسير أن يستنبط واحد جميع ما يحتاج إليه من معرفة أنواع القياس الفقهي. Just remember that also you do the same thing in Islamic law when you study these qiyasat. Nobody keeps questioning the qiyasat that were established in the second Islamic century or the third Islamic century. So if you do that and you give your predecessor in Islamic law the courtesy of controlling some of what you think and you just build on what you do, the same thing is true in a more foundational, more important, more basic science kind of thinking, which is about how we think at all, not just about law. وإن كان غيرنا قد فحص عن ذلك فبين أنه يجب علينا أن نستعين على ما نحن بسبيله بما قال. So this is a beautiful word, نستعين. He's not saying let's imitate them, but let's use what they have. We use what they have to aid ourselves. We seek help. We get their help on this, which means that we can discard some of that. سواء كان ذلك الغير مشاركا لنا أو غير مشارك في الملة. This is the ultimate point. Occasionally you find these people, while using a very good method, arriving at wrong conclusions as far as metaphysics or the basic faith. They might have a different millah, or they might simply be politically different from us. The word millah, has this checkered history because we know Darush is a very good reader of Farabi. We know that the two invocations of millah in his mind are immediately nation, that is a people, which of course might not mean necessarily that these people think differently in every respect. So there could be different nations. But the word millah in Farabi would limit the nation to those who share religion. And the other one is is basically religion, right? So millah indicates both a population and a certain nation and a religion. There is a treatise by Farabi on millah. And what that means, we could read it together if you want as a bonus for that class too. فإن الآلة التي تصح بها التذكية ليس يعتبر في صحة التذكية بها كونها آلة لمشارك لنا في الملة. Here's another analogy. When I get a knife to prepare an animal for food, I don't stipulate that this knife be made by a Muslim. Do you do that? If you do that, that's just tough life. So think of the Aristotelian syllogism as a knife. I don't ask that the knife be made by someone who shares my religion, أو غير مشارك, right? إذا كانت فيها شروط الصحة. So it has to be just a good knife. It has to cut. The same is true about the syllogism. وإذا كان الأمر هكذا وكان كل ما يحتاج إليه في النظر من أمر المقاييس العقلية قد فحص عنه القدماء وأتم فحصا، فقد ينبغي أن نضرب بأيدينا في إلى كتبهم فننظر فيما قالوه من ذلك، فإن كان كله صوابا قبلناه منهم، إن كان فيه ما ليس بصواب نبهنا عليه. So we just need to study, be critical, and we will reject what we think doesn't work. فإذا فرغنا من هذا الجنس من النظر وحصلت عندنا الآلات التي بها نقدر على الاعتبار في الموجودات والصنعة فيها، فإن من لا يعرف الصنعة لا يعرف المصنوع، ومن لا يعرف المصنوع لا يعرف الصانع. Again, repeating the basic method. Question for him is, well, if we do that, then we'll go and study the world. And because, remember, if you don't know the world enough, you're not going to know anything about its maker. So we have to be physicists of sorts. وبين أيضا أن هذا الغرض إنما يتم لنا في الموجودات بتداول الفحص عنها واحد بعد واحد وأن يستعين في ذلك المتأخر بالمتقدم. So we have to study these existing things and we have to draw on old wisdom على مثال ما عرض في علوم التعاليم. So the same thing with mathematics. تعليم is mathematics, And ta'lim in a general concept will include, more general concept will include also study of the orbits or astronomy. You know, the basic connection here is between mathematics, music, astronomy, and mathematics. There's arithmetic and there's geometry. These things are supposed to be neutral. It's what we call STEM now, right? Don't we call it? Yeah. So these areas of inquiry, you just can't put a badge on it. You can't put a brand on it. It's not going to be, once you get to numbers, it doesn't matter what the language is. A Chinese guy is going to do the same thing that, say, a Canadian mathematician will do. So he says, فإنه لو فرضنا صناعة الهندسة في وقتنا هذه معدومة وكذلك صناعة علم الهيئة. So هندسة is geometry and هيئة is astronomy. ورام إنسان واحد من تلقاء نفسه أن يدرك مقادير الأجرام السماوية وأشكالها لما أمكنه ذلك. If we didn't have all these previous studies, for example, about the ratio of Jupiter to the sun, or the ratio of the Earth to the sun. مثل, here's an example, أن يعرف قدر الشمس من الأرض وغير ذلك من مقادير الكواكب. ولو كان أذكى الناس فقط. Someone who wants to do all this and rejects in principle to study any previous methods that precede his religion without a revelation إلا بوحي أو شيء يشبه الوحي. بل لو قيل له إن الشمس أعظم من الأرض بنحو 150 ضعفا. That's not exactly accurate. It's not 150 times. Or 160 times, but it's close to the truth. But if somebody tells you that if you put on the diameter of the Earth of the sun 150 or 160 Earths, that that person, without studying this, without knowing that this issue actually has been resolved, he would say that's crazy. هذا جنون من قائله وهذا شيء قد قام عليه البرهان في علم الهيئة قيام الأشباه. And this is something that has been established. When you say, no, I'm going to get this only from my revelation, you just look like a stupid idiot. Let's actually look it up again. I keep forgetting the ratio. So if we say how many Earths fit on the sun's 110, maybe. Right? Yeah, 110, not 150 or 60, but their calculation at the time was that 150, 160. So yes, it would be crazy. And this, in fact, actually is something that Ghazali says in Al-Maqal. He says, if I have someone saying, well, I need to study math only if the Quran seems to permit it explicitly, or medicine only if it seems that the Quran permits it, that person is just, he calls him Sadiqun Jahil. Right? This is the ignorant friend who's an ignoramus, whose friendship is a cost. It doesn't add anything to me. In fact, it takes away, of course. وما الذي أحوج في هذا إلى التمثيل بصناعة التعليم؟ وهذه صناعة أصول الفقه والفقه نفسه. لم يكمل النظر فيها إلا بعد زمن طويل. The same idea of let's go back to the origins, because after the origins, the Salafi thought. He says, well, you could say the same thing about usul al-fiqh and fiqh. This stuff is made up, and which, of course, if you wait 200 years and get to Ibn Taymiyyah, that's something like that begins to be said. But he also says the same thing. If you try to invent your own madhab, a new madhab, it's just not going to work. You have to trust a little bit. So, he actually here, this is an interesting thing. I talked about it in another context where he says, only in the West, only in the Maghreb and Spain, people can say, oh, you don't have to study fiqh and usul because you can go back to the Sunnah. So there was that Salafism that bugged him in his time. And he said, let's actually read this sentence, it's very beautiful. ولو رام إنسان من تلقاء نفسه أن يقف على جميع الحجج التي استنبطها النظار من أهل الذكر في مسائل الخلاف التي وضعت المناظرة فيها بينهم في معظم بلاد الإسلام ما عدا المغرب. So only the Moroccans can make this stupid argument. If someone were to say, oh, I'm going to study all these madhabs and come up with my own conclusion because I have to have safe knowledge, he says, لكان أهلا أن يضحك منه. People will make fun of that person. That person will only not look like an idiot in our backward countries. Because people know that won't work. ممتنع means impossible. Now, given the fact that it's also done already. So you're A, unable to do it, and B, it's already been done. وهذا أمر بين بنفسه ليس في الصناعة العلمية فقط بل وفي العملية. Do the same thing about carpentry. Do the same thing about any practical form of art. صناعة any industry فإنه ليس منها صناعة يقدر أن ينشئها واحد بعينه فكيف بصناعة الصناعي وهي الحكمة. Okay, so you have to work within the paradigm. If we take Thomas Kuhn's idea, you have to work within the paradigm until you know that it doesn't work. Let's stop here.